Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we unravel the complex tapestry of history to bring you essential understandings. Today, we're plunging into the extraordinary life and presidency of a figure whose influence, well, it still echoes through American society. Lyndon Baines Johnson. His story is one of incredible ambition, legislative triumph, and, yes, profound tragedy. You might think you know LBJ, but we're going to uncover some surprising facets and crucial turning points that shaped his legacy. We're aiming to extract those critical insights, offering you a shortcut to being truly well-informed about a man who was, in many ways, an enigma.
Indeed. And we're drawing our insights from a comprehensive source, tracing Johnson's path right from his humble beginnings in rural Texas all the way to the highest office in the land. We'll be examining the pivotal moments, the policies, and of course the complex personality that defined him. It's quite a journey through ambition, power, and those profound moral questions leaders always grapple with.
Okay, let's unpack this. We begin, as you said, in the dusty, tough landscape of rural Texas, the very place that forged Lyndon Baines Johnson. He was born August 27, 1908, near Stonewall, on the Pedernales River, the eldest of 5 children, to Samuel Ely Johnson, Jr. and Rebecca Baines. And it's an intriguing detail, isn't it, that he didn't even have a name for 3 months because his parents couldn't agree.
Right. They finally settled on Lyndon, apparently inspired by a criminal lawyer, a county lawyer his father admired, and his mother insisted on that specific spelling.
A county lawyer.
Yeah. And that detail, his unnamed infancy and the environment he grew up in, it's incredibly telling. Biographer Robert Caro, he vividly described his upbringing as being in a land without electricity, where the soil was so rocky that it was hard to earn a living from it. This isn't just, a picturesque detail for color. It's really a foundational piece for understanding his relentless drive, his fierce desire to escape poverty, and ultimately, his later commitment to those sweeping anti-poverty programs. This deeply personal experience shaped his understanding of the need for opportunity, for social mobility. It roots his later legislative ambitions in a very real, almost visceral sense of need.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, that environment must have deeply shaped his understanding of poverty and the need for opportunity. And you can see how that experience directly fed into his path as a teacher.
Yeah.
Johnson graduated from Johnson City High School in 1924, quite young, only 15. And he was already active in public speaking, debate, baseball.
Right. He initially left Southwest Texas State Teachers College, WTSTC they called it, went off to California, worked odd jobs, but he came back, enrolled in 1926, worked his way through school, continued with debate and campus politics, even edited the school newspaper, the College Star.
But here's where it gets really interesting, as you said, and it provides such a critical lens for understanding his future. For 9 crucial months, 1928 to 29, he actually paused his studies. Why? To teach Mexican-American children at the segregated Wellhausen School in Cotulla, Texas.
And this experience had a profound and undeniable impact on him. This wasn't just some biographical detail. It's really a critical lens. It helps you understand how Johnson, who was such a master pragmatist, could seemingly transform on civil rights later on. His early exposure rooted these issues in personal conviction, making them not just, political battles, but moral imperatives he felt he couldn't ignore as president.
And he even spoke about it years later, didn't he? In 1965, when he went back to San Marcos after signing the Higher Education Act, Johnson reminisced, and I think the quote is really powerful here. He said, "I shall never forget the faces of the boys and the girls in that little Wellhausen Mexican school. College was closed to practically every one of those children because they were too poor." And I think it was then that I made up my mind that this nation could never rest while the door to knowledge remained closed to any American.
What a statement.
It really is. What's fascinating here is how this early direct exposure to deep-seated inequality, that stark lack of opportunity, it just directly fueled his later legislative passions, especially in education and civil rights. For Johnson, this wasn't abstract policy. It was deeply personal, rooted in the faces of those kids he taught. It just shows how profoundly early life experiences can shape a leader's entire political philosophy, sometimes even overriding what might look like political expediency later on. So, from the classroom, he takes his first steps into Washington. In 1931, Johnson gets a position as legislative secretary to Congressman Richard M. Clayburgh. And this was thanks to recommendations from his father and a state senator, Welly Hopkins.
Right. And what's notable is that Clayburgh, he apparently had little interest in the day-to-day duties. He delegated most of them to Johnson.
Which gave a young aide I mean, unparalleled access and responsibility, right? His formal introduction to the real inner workings of Congress.
Exactly. And he quickly cultivated relationships, became Speaker of the Little Congress, this group of congressional aides, and he started befriending powerful figures, people like Vice President John Nance Garner and House Speaker Sam Rayburn.
And this early exposure to FDR's New Deal, it cemented him as a lifelong supporter, didn't it? Aligning him with those progressive policies he'd later champion.
Absolutely. This foundational period was critical. It taught him how to navigate Washington, build alliances, understand the levers of power, skills he would hone to an extraordinary degree.
And then, in 1935, he takes on a new role. He becomes the Texas State Administrator of the National Youth Administration, the NYA.
Yeah, that put him squarely in the New Deal machine, but it also gave him direct administrative experience, a different kind of power.
And he absolutely plunged into it. Traveled across Texas, tirelessly securing financial sponsors for construction projects. Within just 6 months, he had 18,000 young Texans working, building roads, parks, schools, other public buildings.
But he wasn't an easy boss, apparently.
No, described as notoriously tough, demanding long workdays, even working weekends. This was a man with immense energy, already showing signs of the force he'd become.
Which, raises that important question about the nature of ambition. And Robert Caro offers a really striking observation here. He noted that Johnson's ambition was uncommon in the degree to which it was unencumbered by even the slightest excess weight of ideology, of philosophy, of principles, of beliefs.
Well, unencumbered by ideology.
Exactly. He was driven by power and control. A trait that would both propel his career to, unprecedented heights and, at times, complicate his public image and actions. It's a key to understanding his legislative prowess, but also maybe his perceived ruthlessness. He wasn't necessarily driven by a fixed ideology, but by the desire to achieve, and power was the means to that end.
That drive for power certainly characterized his congressional career. In 1937, Johnson successfully campaigns for Texas's 10th congressional district in a special election, ran on a strong New Deal platform. He served as a U.S. representative until 1949, and President Roosevelt clearly saw him as a valuable political ally.
Right, and a vital source of information on Texas politics, plus the machinations of Vice President Garner and Speaker Rayburn. FDR liked having eyes and ears everywhere.
During this time, he showed remarkable skill in bringing federal resources back to his district, an early mastery of legislative mechanics and, patronage.
Oh, definitely. As a member of the House Naval Affairs Committee, Johnson was instrumental in planning that huge naval air training base at Corpus Christi. He also helped establish shipbuilding sites in Houston and Orange, a Navy reserve station in Dallas. Beyond that, he sponsored numerous federal projects for his district, things like securing cheap electricity under the Rural Electrification Administration, the REA, and pushing for the completion of the Mansfield Dam on the Colorado River. He knew how to deliver for his constituents, build that political capital.
And it also highlights a controversial tendency we'd see again and again. He was known to steer these projects toward contractors he knew personally.
Like Herman and George Brown.
Exactly, who would later finance much of his career. This wasn't just, friendship. He was a clear example of how that patronage system worked. Using government appointments or favors like steering contracts to build political loyalty and secure support for his broader agenda.
Yeah, quid pro quo.
But what's also important to remember is that during this period, he maintained a hostile position towards civil rights legislation. He aligned with other Southern Democrats, voting against anti-lynching bills, anti-poll tax measures, Fair Employment Practice Committee bills.
Yes, that's a critical point for historical context. It speaks to the complex evolution of his political identity. His early career was deeply entrenched in the Southern political norms of that time. This balancing act, or maybe a flexible approach to principles where personal conviction, like we saw with the Wellhausen School, could coexist or even override political expediency, depending on the context, it becomes a recurring theme. His ambition often dictated his alliances.
His ambition then led him to set his sights higher, on the Senate. In 1941, Senator Morris Shepherd of Texas died, triggering a special election, and Johnson decided to run. He narrowly lost by just 1,311 votes to Governor W. Lee Papio Daniel.
But there's more to that story, isn't there? Robert Caro's research suggests this election might have been manipulated by alcohol industry lobbyists.
Really? How so?
Well, the theory is they wanted O'Daniel in the Senate to get a wet lieutenant governor, someone favorable to the alcohol industry, into the governorship. And Caro argues they swayed about 200 votes in East Texas. Johnson, according to Caro, ultimately lost by just 0.23%. a tiny margin.
Wow, that specific incident, it really raises questions about how early career narratives are constructed and how deeply ingrained political manipulation could be back then.
It does. The blending of actual service with these controversial circumstances, it sort of foreshadows a pattern in his public image. And speaking of service, shortly after this loss, right after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Johnson became one of the first members of Congress to volunteer for active military duty.
A remarkable shift from a contested election loss straight into wartime service. He was appointed President Roosevelt's personal representative to the Navy, sent on a survey mission to the Pacific Theater.
And he received the Silver Star from General Douglas MacArthur for gallantry in action during an aerial combat mission over New Guinea.
But even this achievement has controversy swirling around it. While some accounts support the citation, Robert Caro famously noted that, the fact is, LBJ never got within sight of Japanese forces. His combat experience was a myth.
Right, though Caro also quoted that the weight of the evidence at this moment is that the plane was attacked by Zeros and that he was cool under fire.
So, it's complicated. It's a testament to the conflicting stories and the difficulty in separating fact from legend that seemed to follow him throughout his career.
Indeed. It highlights the inherent difficulty in separating fact from legend, especially with powerful figures who become adept at shaping their own image. And then, of course, we have the infamous 1948 Senate election. This one truly cemented his reputation for bare-knuckle politics, earning him that sardonic nickname, Landslide Lyndon.
Oh, this is a truly legendary story of political maneuvering. Johnson ran again for the U.S. Senate in 1948. He won the general election, sure, but his Democratic primary victory against former Governor Coke Stevenson was highly controversial. He campaigned aggressively, using a rented Sikorsky S-51 helicopter, dubbed the Johnson City Windmill, to draw crowds. Stevenson initially led, forcing a runoff.
But here's where Box 13 comes in, a defining moment, really, of his political ruthlessness. Johnson's narrow 87-vote victory out of nearly 1 million votes cast was based on 200 patently fraudulent ballots recorded 6 days after the election, and they came from Box 13 in Jim Wells County, a notorious political stronghold of boss George Parr.
And the specifics are quite striking, aren't they? These ballots were found to be in alphabetical order, written with the same pen and handwriting.
Right. And some listed voters later insisted they hadn't actually voted that day. Election Judge Luis Salas even later admitted certifying 202 fraudulent ballots. Robert Caro further argued thousands of fraudulent votes existed in other counties too, including maybe 10,000 votes switched in San Antonio alone.
This isn't just a detail. It's a foundational story of LBJ's political ruthlessness and his skill in that bare-knuckle political world. And the timely help from his friend, Abe Fortas, who'd later become a Supreme Court justice in the subsequent legal battle, that was crucial. Fortas helped prevent federal jurisdiction, ensuring Johnson's victory.
And Johnson just embraced the nickname Landslide Lyndon.
So even at this early stage, you see this pattern emerging, a willingness to bend, or maybe even break, the rules to secure power. Did this Machiavellian streak ever truly serve the greater good, or did it always carry an ethical cost? It's a consistent thread, this extraordinary ambition and pragmatism.
His ascent continued rapidly in the Senate, became Democratic whip in 1951, then, remarkably, majority leader in 1954. And historians like Caro and Dallek, they consider him the most effective Senate majority leader ever. This wasn't just about accumulating titles. It was about masterfully wielding legislative power.
Okay, let's unpack that. What made him so effective? Our sources describe him as unusually proficient at gathering information.
Even the greatest intelligence gatherer Washington has ever known. He knew every senator's stance, their philosophy, their prejudices, strengths, weaknesses.
And, crucially, exactly what it took to get their vote.
And that deep knowledge fed into his legendary persuasion tactic, known famously as the Johnson treatment.
Ah, yes, the treatment.
Journalists Roland Evans and Robert Novak described it vividly. They said, the treatment could last 10 minutes or 4 hours. Its tone could be supplication, accusation, cajolery, exuberance, scorn, tears, complaint, and the hint of threat. It was all of these together.
Yeah.
Johnson anticipated them before they could be spoken. He moved in close, his face a scant millimeter from his target, his eyes widening and narrowing. From his pockets poured clippings, memos, statistics.
It sounds terrifying.
It wasn't just intimidation, though. It was this unparalleled form of psychological warfare rooted in meticulous research. It allowed Johnson to predict and disarm objections before they were even voiced, making policymaking a deeply personal, almost inescapable experience for his targets.
What a picture. And he used these skills not just for personal gain, but for genuine legislative reform sometimes. He reformed the seniority system for committee assignments, giving freshman senators more relevant roles.
True, but he also used his political influence to secure broadcast licenses for his wife from the FCC, demonstrating that mastery of patronage and political favors.
Well, he's obsessed with getting unanimous subcommittee reports, too, a testament to his desire for control and consensus.
And on the national stage, he provided important bipartisan support to President Eisenhower on foreign policy matters, and famously appalled by the Soviet launch of Sputnik, he used his influence to pass the National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958, establishing NASA, and then made himself its first chairman. Classic Johnson.
This period is so crucial for understanding that complex calculus of power, and maybe the moral compromises he was willing to make to gain and wield it effectively. What's fascinating here is his significant shift on civil rights, despite his earlier votes against civil rights legislation.
As Majority Leader, he notably did not sign the 1956 Southern Manifesto, which opposed integration. That was a big step for a Southern politician then.
And then he shepherded the Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1960, the first such bills since Reconstruction to passage.
Right, albeit by negotiating a middle course and removing key enforcement provisions to appease that powerful Southern bloc. He had to compromise.
He began to distance himself from the Southern Caucus, even joining the Democrats' Western Regional Conference in 1959.
It demonstrates a pragmatism that would later serve his Great Society ambitions. A willingness to adapt his political posture to align with national tides and his own growing influence.
Moving into the 1960s, Johnson's Senate success made him a potential Democratic presidential candidate in 1960. He tried to sort of sit out the primaries, relying on his legislative record and party support.
But he underestimated John F. Kennedy's charm, didn't he? His Stop Kennedy coalition ultimately failed, and he lost the nomination to Kennedy.
But then the surprise. Kennedy offered Johnson the vice presidential nomination.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is why. It was a highly strategic move to attract Southern votes, balancing a liberal Bostonian Catholic with a, more conservative Southerner from the Disciples of Christ. A calculated decision aimed at uniting the Democratic Party's disparate wings.
Politically shrewd, definitely, but not without controversy. Labor leaders, for example, vehemently opposed Johnson. AFL-CIO President George Meany called him the arch-foe of labor.
And Johnson, ever the strategist, even sought and secured a change in Texas law, allowing him to run for both vice president and a third Senate term.
He won both, then resigned his Senate seat. Always kept his options open, didn't he?
Absolutely. Once in office, though, Johnson quickly became concerned about the traditionally ineffective nature of the vice presidency. This reveals a proud, powerful man suddenly confined to a largely ceremonial role, constantly seeking influence. He tried to transfer his Senate Majority Leader authority to the VP office,
but faced vehement opposition from within the Democratic caucus.
Right. He even drafted an executive order to give him general supervision over national security. But Kennedy only signed a non-binding letter asking him to review policies.
He was also denied an office adjacent to the Oval Office, denied a full-time White House staff. It was a clear diminishment of his power.
And it wasn't just a lack of official power, it was personal. Many in the Kennedy White House, including Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, were openly contemptuous of Johnson, ridiculed his brusque and crude manner.
Congressman Tip O'Neill even recalled that they actually took pride in snubbing him. A frustrating time for LBJ, you'd imagine.
Definitely. But Kennedy's strategy was to keep him busy and informed. Kennedy apparently said, "I can't afford to have my vice president, who knows every reporter in Washington, going around saying, 'We're all screwed up, so we're going to keep him happy.'"
And he did keep him busy with key assignments. Kennedy appointed Johnson head of the President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunities, where Johnson actually pushed for stronger civil rights actions.
Right. He undertook diplomatic missions, chaired the President's Ad Hoc Committee for Science, and, crucially, chaired the National Aeronautics and Space Council.
Which leads us to another aha moment, right? Space.
Exactly. After the Soviets achieved the first crewed spaceflight, Kennedy tasked Johnson with evaluating the U.S. space program. Johnson recommended committing to landing an American on the moon in the 1960s. Kennedy then prioritized that project, and Johnson's appointment provided important political cover against potential failure. It shows Kennedy's shrewd use of Johnson's ambition and capability.
A critical moment for the space race. But even as he made strides, shadows began to gather. In August 1963, that Senate scandal involving Bobby Baker, Johnson's protege and secretary to the Majority Leader, emerged.
Yeah, Baker was investigated for bribery and financial malfeasance. A witness even alleged kickbacks for the vice president himself.
Baker resigned, but the negative publicity fueled rumors in Washington that Kennedy planned to drop Johnson from the 1964 ticket.
What's important to clarify here, though, is that despite the deep mutual dislike between Robert Kennedy and Johnson, JFK publicly confirmed on October 31st, 1963, his intention to retain Johnson on the ticket.
Why?
Kennedy acknowledged that dropping him could lead to heavy losses in the South. Pure politics.
So this precarious political situation, a powerful man in a constrained role, battling rumors, personal animosity, it set the stage for the most unexpected and tragic event of his life.
The assassination of John F. Kennedy.
On November 22nd, 1963, in Dallas, Johnson takes the presidential oath of office aboard Air Force One, that iconic photograph. Johnson being sworn in by District Court Judge Sarah T. Hughes, the only president sworn in by a woman with Mrs. Kennedy looking on. It just captures the raw emotion, the rapid transfer of power, a deeply unsettling image.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Johnson firmly believed an immediate show of transition was vital for national stability. That led to his rapid return to Washington, D.C. However, this was met with some accusations of, well, undue haste. Later, the Warren Commission, established by Johnson, concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, a finding that, despite extensive research, continues to be debated and questioned even today.
He asked Kennedy's cabinet to remain, didn't he?
He did. 4 members served his entire term. Even Robert F. Kennedy, despite their poor relationship, stayed on as Attorney General until September 1964. It demonstrated a critical need for continuity in a time of national crisis, a stabilizing force in chaos.
In the immediate aftermath, Johnson seized the moment, framing his actions as fulfilling Kennedy's vision. On November 27, 1963, he delivered that powerful "Let us continue" speech to Congress. He declared that no memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long.
And that wave of national grief, it created immense momentum for his promise to carry out Kennedy's plans.
He swiftly moved on economic reform as well, pursued one of Kennedy's primary legislative goals, a significant tax cut.
Right. He worked with Senator Harry F. Byrd to negotiate a budget reduction below $100 billion, resulting in the Revenue Act of 1964.
What did that do?
It cut individual income tax rates by about 20%, reducing the top marginal rate from a whopping 91% down to 70%, and slightly lowered corporate tax rates.
And the passage of this long-stalled tax cut was crucial, wasn't it? It provided the economic stability and political capital that facilitated efforts to move ahead on civil rights legislation, proved he could deliver on the domestic front.
Which brings us to a legislative masterpiece, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Johnson asked Robert Kennedy to spearhead the bill on Capitol Hill, a strategic move, providing political cover for Johnson.
And biographer Robert Caro highlighted the extraordinary legislative maneuvering involved here. Southern congressmen used every procedural tactic they could to block it.
But Johnson, using a discharge petition, forced it onto the House floor, circumventing the segregationist House Rules Committee Chairman Howard W. Smith.
Explain the discharge petition. That's not common, right?
No, it's a rare and aggressive parliamentary move.
Yeah.
Essentially a way to bypass the committee that's blocking a bill and force it directly to a vote on the House floor. It showed Johnson's unparalleled willingness to break convention to achieve his goals. And it worked. It passed the House 290-110.
So this raises that important question. How do you overcome such entrenched opposition?
Well, the true genius wasn't just its passage, but Johnson's audacious parliamentary acrobatics, a complete circumvention of traditional roadblocks. It proved how sheer political will, married with a deep understanding of congressional rules, could shatter decades of legislative inertia.
And then he took it to the Senate.
Right. He convinced Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield to bring the House bill directly to the full Senate, bypassing the segregationist Senate Judiciary Committee. Another bold move.
And the filibuster.
Yeah.
Always a threat.
Absolutely. To overcome an inevitable filibuster, that delaying tactic used by minority of senators, he secured crucial Republican votes by convincing Republican leader Everett Dirksen. It ultimately passed the Senate 71-29. This was a monumental effort, requiring every ounce of Johnson's treatment and legislative mastery.
Signed into law on July 2, 1964, the act outlawed discrimination based on race, color, national origin, religion, or sex, prohibited segregation in public accommodations, and employment discrimination. A landmark.
And Johnson famously told his aide, Bill Moyers, that evening, "I think we may have lost the South for your lifetime and mine."
And he was right, wasn't he? Predicting that significant political backlash from Southern whites against the Democratic Party. A profound and lasting shift in American politics. A clear example of how taking a moral stand could have deep political consequences.
This brings us to a crucial and often overlooked element in the narrative of his presidency, the 1964 presidential election. Johnson was initially pessimistic about his re-election chances in spring 1964, but he gained confidence after personally mediating a railroad labor dispute, averting a national strike, showed his continued prowess as a negotiator.
Then he had to choose a running mate. He strongly opposed Robert F. Kennedy as his VP selection. That mutual dislike was intense, plus a fear Kennedy would take credit for his election.
So he chose Hubert Humphrey instead, strategically strengthening his position in the Midwest and industrial Northeast, but only after putting Humphrey through, quote, a gauntlet of interviews to guarantee his loyalty.
Classic LBJ demanding fealty.
What's fascinating and a little unsettling is that during this campaign, Johnson requested the FBI send 30 agents to cover the Democratic Convention in Atlantic City, specifically focusing on the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the MFDP delegation. This included wiretaps of Martin Luther King's room and other civil rights groups.
Wow. That reveals the extent of his political paranoia, maybe, and his willingness to use federal resources for political ends, even against civil rights allies.
It seems so. The MFDP itself was a significant challenge for Johnson at the convention. He managed their challenge to the all-white segregationist delegation.
What was the compromise?
They offered 2 MFDP delegates as observers and pledged to bar future discriminatory delegations. The MFDP rejected it.
And SNCC Chairman John Lewis called it a turning point in the civil rights movement, a moment where disillusionment with the mainstream Democratic Party began to set in for some activists.
And then, of course, there was the campaign itself against Barry Goldwater. Johnson's campaign used that famous Daisy ad on September 7, 1964.
Linking Goldwater to nuclear war. Powerful, controversial stuff. Played on Cold War fears.
Definitely. And this raises that important question about the ethics of campaigning again. CIA Director William Colby later asserted the CIA was instructed to spy on the Goldwater campaign for Johnson, another unsettling revelation of his use of power.
But the result was a landslide victory. Johnson won with 61.05% of the popular vote, the highest for a Democratic candidate in history, widest margin in the 20th century at the time.
Secured 486 electoral votes to Goldwater's 52, gained huge Democratic majorities in Congress. This gave him a profound mandate to pursue his ambitious domestic agenda, which he branded the Great Society.
By early 1964, he began using that phrase, Great Society, to describe this ambitious domestic program. And the vision was incredibly broad, wasn't it?
Oh, yes. Urban renewal, modern transportation, a clean environment, anti-poverty initiatives, healthcare reform, crime control, educational reform. It covered almost everything.
And to ensure its passage, Johnson placed an unprecedented emphasis on relations with Congress, leveraging all his decades of experience and presumably the Johnson treatment.
It was a comprehensive blueprint for societal change, and he kicked off this domestic agenda with a bold declaration, the war on poverty.
In his 1964 State of the Union address, Johnson declared an unconditional war on poverty in America, aiming not only to relieve the symptoms of poverty, but to cure it and, above all, to prevent it.
And the results were tangible. During his administration, national poverty declined significantly, dropping from 23% down to 12%.
That's a huge drop.
It is. This comprehensive attack on poverty reflected Johnson's deep-seated belief that government could best help the impoverished by providing economic opportunities, not just direct aid. It fundamentally reshaped the federal government's role in social welfare.
And this assault on poverty included initiatives across education, job training, community development.
Exactly. Think of programs like the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, which created the Office of Economic Opportunity, the OEO, to oversee local community action agencies, or CAAs.
And these CAAs were designed for maximum feasible participation from local residents. Empowering, maybe, but also
contentious. They often threatened established political leaders who saw them as alternative power structures. This tension led to the 1967 Green Amendment, which gave city governments control over CAAs, curbing some of that citizen participation.
The war on poverty also spawned other significant programs. Job Corps.
Right, a residential education and job training program modeled after the Civilian Conservation Corps, providing academic and vocational skills to at-risk youth.
VISTA.
Volunteers in Service to America, a domestic version of the Peace Corps, deploying volunteers on community projects nationwide. By the end of '65, 2,000 volunteers had signed on,
Upper bound.
training low-income students for college.
And the Food Stamp Act of 1964, making President Kennedy's pilot programs permanent.
And this wasn't just about jobs and food. The Housing and Urban Development Act of 1965 provided rent subsidies, funded 240,000 housing units, allocated $3 billion for urban renewal.
And the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, was established in September 65 to oversee these programs.
Plus, the Appalachian Regional Development Act provided $1.1 billion for public works in Appalachia, targeting a region of deep poverty. However, not all programs were unqualified successes. The Model Cities program, an urban renewal effort, received reduced funding, and the New York Times later called it largely a failure. Highlights the ambitious scope, but also the inherent challenges of such large-scale social engineering.
From poverty alleviation, he then turned to healthcare, another cornerstone of his Great Society. Johnson focused on hospital insurance for the aged under Social Security.
The program, named Medicare, was championed by Representative Wilbur Mills. And to reduce Republican opposition, it was ingeniously structured.
How so?
It had 3 layers: compulsory hospital insurance, voluntary insurance for doctor visits, and then Medicaid, a state-administered program providing medical assistance for the poor. This layering helped diffuse opposition and build broad support.
And the Medicare bill passed Congress on July 28, 1965.
And its impact is undeniable. Medicare now covers tens of millions of Americans, stands as one of his most lasting legacies.
Beyond healthcare, his administration also reshaped the nation's demographics through immigration reform. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 reformed the country's immigration system.
Specifically, repealing that restrictive national origins formula that had been in place for decades. That formula had restricted immigration from outside Western Europe and the Western Hemisphere.
And the impact was dramatic. The annual rate of inflow doubled between 1965 and 1970, doubled again by 1990. Huge increases from Asia and Latin America fundamentally changed the face of American society over the long term.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, though, scholars actually give Johnson little credit for this law. They note it wasn't one of his top priorities, and he'd previously supported the unpopular McCarran-Walter Act of 1952, which kept many old restrictions.
So maybe an unintended consequence?
Perhaps, or just not his main focus. But its long-term demographic impact is undeniable and completely reshaped American society, even if it wasn't his primary focus at the time.
Then there was education, a deeply personal cause for Johnson, drawing from his own experience as a teacher, right?
Absolutely. He believed education was essential for the American dream, especially for minorities, made it a top Great Society priority.
The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESI, of 1965, proposed to double federal spending on education from $4 billion to $8 billion, passed both houses quickly.
And ESA increased funding for all districts, but directed more money to those with large proportions of poor students, a truly groundbreaking approach for the time.
He didn't stop there. The Higher Education Act of 1965 increased federal funds for universities, created scholarships, provided low-interest student loans, established a teacher corps.
He also initiated Head Start, that early education program to prepare disadvantaged children for public school, signed the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967, creating educational television programs like PBS.
Plus, in 1965, he established the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts, supporting literature, history, law, the arts.
These were sweeping educational and cultural reforms, reflecting a really holistic vision for the Great Society.
His impact also extended to the environment and infrastructure. Johnson signed over 300 conservation measures into law, formed the legal basis of the modern environmental movement.
That included the Clean Air Act of 1963, setting emission standards, and its 1965 amendment, the Motor Vehicle Air Pollution Control Act.
The Wilderness Act of 1964 preserved 9.1 million acres of forest land. The Land and Water Conservation Fund aided the purchase of land for federal and state parks.
And his wife, Lady Bird Johnson, played a significant role here, championing the Highway Beautification Act of 1965. Aimed to control outdoor advertising, required removal or screening of junkyards along highways.
In terms of infrastructure, in 1966, he created a new Department of Transportation, consolidating various agencies, streamlining federal oversight, a practical administrative achievement alongside the grander social programs.
And as a response to the growing violence in America, particularly after the assassination of Robert Kennedy, Johnson signed the Gun Control Act of 1968.
What did that do specifically?
It prohibited convicted felons, drug users, and the mentally ill from purchasing handguns, raised record-keeping and licensing requirements, banned mail-order sales of rifles and shotguns,
What's fascinating here, though, is historian Jeff Schiesel's argument. He suggests Johnson's long-standing contempt for Robert Kennedy might explain why he didn't invoke RFK's memory when signing this bill, unlike how he often invoked JFK.
A subtle but telling detail, maybe, about the complex, often bitter personal relationships at the highest levels of power, even in moments of national tragedy.
As the Great Society took shape and achieved these monumental legislative victories, so did immense challenges, particularly domestic unrest. The Johnson years were marked by a series of long, hot summers of civil unrest. Started with the Harlem riots in '64, the Watts riots in Los Angeles in '65.
And the Watts riots, tragically, resulted in 34 deaths, $35 million in property damage. It significantly halted the momentum for further civil rights advancements as public fear of escalating violence grew, a brutal awakening for many Americans.
The situation escalated dramatically in 1967. More than 150 riots erupted across the U.S. The Boston Globe called it a revolution of black Americans against white Americans.
The Newark riots left 26 dead. The Detroit riot resulted in 43 deaths, 2,250 injuries, 4,000 arrests. It was chaos.
Governor George Romney of Michigan sent National Guard troops to Detroit. Johnson eventually deployed federal troops with tanks and machine guns.
Attorney General Ramsey Clark warned of a guerrilla war in the streets due to untrained local police and National Guardsmen citing sniper fire in Newark and Detroit.
The political fallout was severe. Johnson's popularity plummeted amidst a massive white political backlash, reinforced a perception that he'd lost control of major cities, maybe even his own party.
He created the 11-member Kerner Commission to study the causes of this urban civil disorder. Its 1968 report starkly concluded the nation was moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate, and unequal, suggested legislative measures for racial integration and poverty alleviation.
And LBJ's profound understanding of the historical roots of racial injustice, it's captured by his reported comment to Press Secretary George Christian about the riots.
What was that?
He said, "What did you expect? When you put your foot on a man's neck and hold him down for 300 years and then you let him up, what's he going to do? He's going to knock your block off."
Wow. That highlights his awareness of the deep-seated historical context, even as he grappled with the immediate chaos and political fallout. Shows a powerful, almost prophetic understanding of the consequences of systemic oppression.
By 1966, the press perceived a credibility gap between Johnson's statements and the realities of the Vietnam War, led to increasingly unfavorable coverage.
Right. And there were significant political warning signs. Democratic Governor Warren E. Hearns of Missouri warned Johnson he'd lose the state by 100,000 votes. He cited frustration over Vietnam, too much federal spending and taxation, no great public support for your Great Society programs, and public disenchantment with the civil rights programs. A brutal assessment.
This indicated a severe erosion of public trust and political capital. And despite record wages, low unemployment, high corporate farm profits,
A 4.5% jump in consumer prices and rising interest rates caused concern. Johnson reluctantly requested a temporary 6% surcharge in income taxes to address the mounting deficit.
his approval ratings consistently stayed below 50%. By December '66, his disapproval rating surpassed his approval rating. The twin burdens of Vietnam and the cost of the Great Society were taking their toll.
Johnson, for his part, he attributed his diminished popularity to his dominating personality, a press that showed complete irresponsibility and lie and misstate facts, and the preachers, liberals, and professors who had turned against him, basically everyone but him.
The 1966 congressional elections saw Republicans gain 3 Senate and 47 House seats, reinvigorated the conservative coalition, made further Great Society legislation harder to pass.
Though remarkably, Congress ultimately passed almost 96% of his proposed programs, an astounding figure, really, demonstrating his continued legislative influence despite the headwinds.
Amidst these growing domestic and international pressures, Johnson maintained steadfast support for the space program. During his administration, NASA advanced the Gemini program, developed the Saturn V rocket, prepared for Apollo flights.
The Apollo 1 cabin fire in January '67, tragically killing the entire crew, was a devastating setback. Johnson, however, supported NASA's internal investigation rather than appointing an external commission.
He maintained staunch support for Apollo through controversy. And the first 2 crewed missions, Apollo 7 and the first crewed flight to the moon, Apollo 8, were completed by the end of his term.
He even congratulated the Apollo 8 crew, saying, "You've taken all of us all over the world into a new era." He later attended the Apollo 11 launch as a former president. This commitment was a testament to his belief in American exceptionalism and technological prowess.
But no challenge defined his presidency more than the Vietnam War. When Johnson took office, there were 16,700 American military personnel in South Vietnam.
And he ultimately supported the escalation of the U.S. role to prevent the spread of communism, fearing a loss of domestic political credibility and international reputation if the U.S. didn't stand firm.
This was a continuity from Kennedy, who'd signed National Security Action Memorandum 263, NSM 263, in October 63, ordering a withdrawal of 1,000 military personnel.
But Johnson signed NSM 273 on November 26, just days after taking office, reaffirming support for South Vietnam, a different direction.
The key turning point came in August 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Ambiguous evidence suggested 2 U.S. destroyers were attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats.
Johnson responded by obtaining the Gulf of Tonkin resolution from Congress, gave him basically blanket approval for military force, a critical expansion of presidential power in wartime, and it immediately escalated things, drawing the U.S. deeper in.
Escalation truly began in February 65 with Operation Rolling Thunder, a systematic bombing campaign initiated after a Viet Cong attack killed 8 Americans at Pleiku Air Base.
This continuous bombing of North Vietnam lasted until late 1968. Tragically killed tens of thousands of Vietnamese civilians.
In March 65, Johnson agreed to American ground operations, shifting the mission from defensive to offensive. 3,500 troops landed near Da Nang, the first U.S. combat forces in mainland Asia since the Korean War. The war was no longer just an advisory role.
By late July, advisors recommended increasing troops from 75,000 to over 200,000. A choice Johnson reluctantly accepted. He felt boxed in, fearing being seen as an interventionist or facing impeachment if he didn't stand firm against communism.
By October 1965, over 200,000 troops were deployed.
And this period also saw a growing dissent. Senator Robert F. Kennedy harshly criticized the bombing campaign in '66, warning of a road from which there is no turning back. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee held televised hearings on Vietnam policy, further fueling public debate and that growing sense of unease.
Conflicting reports emerged. Polls showed Americans favored the bombing 5.1 in July 66, but a Defense Department study in August indicated minimal impact.
Johnson was urged to begin peace talks, but Hanoi's demand for unilateral U.S. withdrawal was a consistent obstacle. By late '66, it was clear the air campaign and pacification efforts had failed.
So Johnson agreed to add 70,000 troops in 1967 and increased bombings, desperately seeking a breakthrough.
By mid-1967, nearly 70,000 Americans were killed or wounded. The war was widely described as a stalemate. A July Gallup poll showed 52% disapproval of LBJ's handling of the war.
Despite this, he approved an increase to 525,000 troops, seemingly unable to alter course.
Internally, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara publicly questioned the effectiveness of bombing, astounding the Joint Chiefs. But LBJ received CIA reports confirming aspects of McNamara's analysis.
McNamara, along with Bill Moyers, George Bundy, George Ball, they eventually resigned over the war.
Right. In November '67, Johnson convened that group of veteran foreign policy experts, the Wise Men. They unanimously advised him to stay the course.
So Johnson then publicly assured Americans, "We are inflicting greater losses than we're taking. We are making progress."
What's fascinating here is that internal struggle and the credibility gap that began to widen between official statements and public perception. It significantly eroded trust in his leadership.
Amidst increasing anti-war protests, Johnson engaged the FBI and CIA to investigate, monitor, undermine activists. Even though CIA findings refuted his belief that foreign communist sources were behind major demonstrations.
It's a stark illustration of how the pressures of war can lead to extreme measures, even against one's own citizens.
This all culminated in January 1968 with the Tet Offensive, a massive surprise attack launched by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army against South Vietnam cities.
Although a military failure for North Vietnam, it was a profound psychological victory. It definitively turned American public opinion against the war. The public, repeatedly assured of progress, saw images that contradicted that narrative. Trust was shattered.
The psychological impact was immense. In February '68, influential CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite declared the conflict deadlocked. Johnson's reaction was famously, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America."
And he was right. Approval for Johnson's war handling plummeted to 26%, 63% disapproved. Anti-war protests intensified with chants like, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? The country was fractured.
The Tet Offensive convinced key administration leaders, including the Wise Men, who'd previously advised staying the course, and new Defense Secretary Clark Clifford, that further troop escalation was futile.
Johnson, though initially reluctant, agreed to a partial bombing halt and signaled willingness for peace talks. This was a critical turning point in his presidency, a painful recognition that military victory wasn't achievable under the current strategy.
Beyond Vietnam, Johnson engaged in other foreign policy matters. In 1965, a civil war erupted in the Dominican Republic. On Abe Fortas's advice, Johnson dispatched over 20,000 Marines to evacuate Americans, restore order, help arrange elections.
But this use of force alienated many in Latin America. They viewed it as a return to interventionist policies.
With the Soviet Union, while focused on containment, Johnson prioritized arms control deals with Moscow, driven partly by the worsening Sino-Soviet split, which created new diplomatic opportunities.
He attempted to ease tensions with China, but the Cultural Revolution ended hopes for rapprochement. His administration pursued agreements, signed the Outer Space Treaty and the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, laying groundwork for the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT.
He even held an amicable meeting with Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin at the Glassboro Summit in 1967.
Though a planned nuclear disarmament summit was canceled after Soviet forces suppressed the Prague Spring, always ups and downs.
On the domestic front, his administration continued the FBI's wiretapping of Martin Luther King Jr., originally authorized by the Kennedy administration.
He also authorized tapping phone conversations of others, including the Vietnamese friends of a Nixon associate. Shows the pervasive nature of surveillance during this period, raising questions about civil liberties even at the highest levels.
Despite the immense domestic pressures and the escalating war, Johnson still conducted 11 international trips to 20 countries, flew 523,000 miles.
His October 66 visit to Australia, for example, was met with anti-war protests, showed opposition to Vietnam was global.
And in December 67, he made the first round-the-world presidential trip, covered 26,959 miles in just 112.5 hours, included a stop at the memorial for Australian Prime Minister Harold Holt.
This detail highlights the sheer volume of his engagements, the global pressures he faced, even as domestic challenges mounted. Illustrates a president trying to manage an increasingly complex world.
And then came the decision that shocked the nation. Johnson would not seek re-election in 1968. Though constitutionally eligible for a second full term, his growing unpopularity made renomination seem impossible to deny. He'd openly considered dropping out in September 67.
He won a narrow victory in the New Hampshire primary on March 12, 68, indicating some lingering support. But then, in that televised speech on March 31, 68, he announced, "I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president."
And his approval ratings, surprisingly, surged, from 36% to 49% the next day.
This raises that important question about his motivations. Historians continue to debate it. Was it vindication? Healing the nation? Lack of goals? Health? His wife's pressure? Outrage over Vietnam?
Sheasal suggests he wanted vindication but left when indicators turned negative. Woods argues he realized he needed to leave for the nation to heal. Dalek points to lack of domestic goals, eroded popularity, poor health. His wife's pressure concluding leaving let him pose as a peacemaker. Bennett attributes it to outrage over his Southeast Asia policy.
There's even speculation he hoped the convention would draft him back into the race. It's clear there wasn't one simple reason, but a confluence of factors, personal and political.
The aftermath was tumultuous. Vice President Hubert Humphrey entered the race. After Robert Kennedy's assassination in June, Humphrey secured the nomination with Johnson's support.
Despite those violent police attacks against anti-war protesters at the tumultuous Democratic National Convention in Chicago,
Humphrey's polling improved after breaking with Johnson's war policy, calling for an end to the bombing of North Vietnam.
Then, in an October surprise, on October 31, 68, Johnson announced a complete cessation of all air, naval, and artillery bombardment of North Vietnam, citing progress in the Paris peace talks.
Ultimately, Republican nominee Richard Nixon won the election.
In shaping the Supreme Court, Johnson appointed Justices Abe Fortas in 65 and Thurgood Marshall in 67, Marshall, of course, becoming the first African-American on the court, a truly historic moment.
Johnson explicitly sought a mole on the Supreme Court, didn't he? Believing Fortas could provide inside information.
Yes, he insisted on Fortas's appointment when an opening arose, despite Fortas's wife's objections.
But in 68, when Johnson nominated Fortas to succeed Earl Warren as Chief Justice,
the nomination was filibustered by senators. Neither Fortas nor Homer Thornberry, nominated to succeed Fortas, were voted upon by the full Senate, a rare public defeat for Johnson in his final months.
After leaving office in January 69, Johnson retired to his ranch in Stonewall, Texas. Historian Michael Beschloss recounts Johnson's immediate post-presidency moment.
Stepping off Air Force One, pulling out a cigarette, his first since that 1955 heart attack, and declaring, "I've now raised you girls, I've now been president, now it's my time."
Beschloss describes this as the start of a very self-destructive spiral, a vivid image of a man shedding the burdens of office, for better or worse.
He collaborated on his memoirs The Vantage Point, published in '71, and Choices We Face in '69. The LBJ Library opened on the University of Texas campus in '71. He bequeathed his ranch to the public as the Lyndon B. Johnson National Historical Park, stipulating it remain a working ranch.
Politically, he gave Nixon high grades in foreign policy, but worried about a premature U.S. withdrawal from South Vietnam, warning of a serious backlash here at home.
In the '72 election, he reluctantly endorsed Democratic nominee George McGovern, who opposed his foreign and defense policies, felt McGovern was too far left.
And his protege, John Connally, headed Democrats for Nixon. Shows how deep the political rifts of the era truly ran.
His personal life saw triumphs and struggles. Married Claudia Alta Lady Bird Taylor in '34. 2 daughters, Linda Bird and Lucy Baines, famously giving them LBJ initials. Even his dog, Little Beagle Johnson.
But he was also known to have had affairs with numerous women during his marriage, a private detail often discussed in biographies.
Health-wise, a 60-cigarette-per-day smoker suffered that near-fatal heart attack in '55 at age 46, prompting him to quit.
He experienced another suspected heart attack, diagnosed as angina, after Kennedy's assassination. In '65, surgery for his gallbladder and a kidney stone.
After leaving the White House, tragically, he returned to some old habits. Gained weight, resumed smoking in late '71. April '72, another major heart attack.
Despite chronic chest pains, a portable oxygen tank, doctor's recommendation for surgery. Heart specialist Michael DeBakey determined his condition was terminal. Heart was just too poor.
The immense stress of the presidency, particularly Vietnam, undoubtedly took a severe toll on his health.
Johnson recorded that hour-long TV interview with Walter Cronkite on January 12, 1973, discussed his legacy, civil rights, still smoking heavily, stating it was better for his heart to smoke than to be nervous.
Just 10 days later, January 2010, 1973, approximately 3:50 p.m., Johnson suffered his final heart attack in his bedroom at the ranch.
Pronounced dead on arrival at San Antonio International Airport at 4:33 p.m., age 64. Cronkite reported his death live.
His passing, just 2 days after Nixon's second inauguration, led to various inauguration activities being canceled.
He was honored with a state funeral, lying in repose at the LBJ Library, then in state at the Capitol, service at the National City Christian Church, buried in his family's private cemetery in Texas, Billy Graham officiating.
It was the last presidential state funeral until Richard Nixon's in 1994, marking the end of an era.
His personality and public image were truly a duality, a tapestry of contradictions. Biographer Randall Woods highlighted his many roles.
Johnson, the son of the tenant farmer, Johnson, the great compromiser, Johnson, the all-knowing, Johnson, the humble, Johnson, the warrior, Johnson, the dove, Johnson, the romantic, Johnson, the heart-headed pragmatist. The list goes on.
Johnson, the preserver of traditions, Johnson, the crusader for social justice, Johnson, the magnanimous, Johnson, the vindictive, or Johnson, the uncouth, LBJ, the hick, Lyndon, the satyr, and Johnson, the usurper. Quite a range.
This complex, even contradictory public image stemmed partly from his deep-seated values. Ultimately, LBJ was a walking paradox, a ruthless operator whose ambition was simultaneously self-serving and profoundly altruistic, channeling his primal drive for power into societal uplift. His contradictions weren't flaws to overcome, but integral parts of his transformative, albeit turbulent, leadership.
He was undoubtedly a legislative giant. Robert Dallek described him as the most powerful majority leader in American history, wielding the Johnson treatment with unparalleled effectiveness.
As president, he vetoed 30 bills, none overridden, a testament to his legislative mastery. Ambitious, tireless, notoriously worked 18 20-hour days.
His Texas roots were evident. The cowboy hat, the boots, love of the rural hill country, transforming that ranch.
And Woods argues those social gospel themes from his childhood inspired his commitment to social justice and his foreign policy of Christian internationalism and nation-building. He once quoted the Methodist social creed, calling it a more perfect description of the American ideal.
So what's his legacy? Historians view Johnson through that dual lens, legislative achievements and failures in Vietnam. His overall ranking among historians remains relatively steady, often higher than his 8 successors.
Though public polling tends to place him lower. Historian Kent Germany summarized the public's often overshadowed view. Remembered for succeeding an assassinated hero, steering the country into a quagmire in Vietnam, cheating on his saintly wife, exposing his stitched-up belly using profanity, picking up dogs by their ears.
Swimming naked with advisors on the White House pool and emptying his bowels while conducting official business. It's a colorful, if unflattering, portrait.
Germany noted that Johnson's reputation suffers the most from his management of the Vietnam War, something that has overshadowed his civil rights and domestic policy accomplishments, and caused Johnson himself to regret his handling of the woman I really loved, the Great Society.
Yet his major legislation is undeniably vast and transformative. Clean Air Act, Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 68, Food Stamp Act, Economic Opportunity Act, Housing and Urban Development Act, Higher Education Act.
Social Security Act, creating Medicare, Medicaid, Voting Rights Act, Immigration and Nationality Services Act, Public Broadcasting Act, Gun Control Act. He also oversaw the FCC's creation of the 911 National Emergency Number.
His impact remains memorialized in institutions like the Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center, the U.S. Department of Education headquarters. Posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1980.
So we've navigated the remarkable trajectory of Lyndon B. Johnson, a man whose deep personal experiences with poverty and prejudice fueled an incredible legislative engine, yet whose presidency became entangled in the quagmire of Vietnam, ultimately overshadowing so many of his domestic achievements.
His Great Society programs laid the groundwork for modern American liberalism, profoundly impacting civil rights, healthcare, education, the environment.
Yet the shadows of the Vietnam War and the personal controversies, they undeniably color our collective memory of him, creating a paradox that historians continue to grapple with.
So what does this all mean for us today? Despite the credibility gap and personal flaws that often dominated the headlines, Johnson was arguably one of the most effective legislative operators the U.S. has ever seen, left a profound and irreversible mark on American society.
How do we, as a nation, reconcile the triumphs of a leader who achieved so much with the tragic failures that defined the end of his term?
It's a powerful question for you to mull over. Can a president be both a champion of justice and a tragic figure of war? And what lessons does that duality hold for leaders confronting monumental challenges today? It's something to ponder as we continue our own deep dive into the complexities of leadership and history.